They paid hundreds of millions or billions to the police, but the family members, the sons, ended up in prison still. One family, their sons got 12 years. They bribed, they paid the police, the judges, prosecutors, but got 12 years imprisonment, and then they helped with the appeal and then got reduced to 6 years. So it shows that it doesn't guarantee even if you bribe.
At a time when some countries in Southeast Asia are reconsidering their drug laws to shift the emphasis onto health and harm minimization, Indonesia and the Philippines are standing firm with their own hardline policies. In Indonesia, half of all incarcerations are for drugs. Last year alone, Indonesian courts sentenced 48 to die, mostly for drug offenses. In the Philippines, police are suspected of killing more than 6,000 users, drug dealers, in a bid to rein in its prevalence there. My next guests are two men who can give an account of the costs of those hardline approaches. Ricky Gunawan is a public defender with a non-profit he helped found dedicated to defending against human rights violations. And I'm joined by Tedjo. He's a one-time drug user who's now a paralegal and first studied the profession while serving time in prison. Ricky, what does it mean to be a public defender? It's not the same as how I might consider it, right? You're paid by the state. You're actually paid by an NGO. Can you tell me a little bit about that? I think you set it up, didn't you?
Yeah, I co-founded LBHM in 2007 with other colleagues. And when we first set up LBHM, it was for general human rights issues. We didn't think about drugs as an expertise or specialty of our work. And in June 2008, during the Anti-Torture Day, we met with communities of people who use drugs for the first time in Jakarta when we held a rally. And they said they experienced torture, police violence during investigations, which is also common practice here. And then they said very few lawyers willing to provide assistance to people who use drugs because of stigma associated with drugs. And that is until today, because no lawyers want to be associated with like drug dealings or drug users, because the image of people who use drugs is seen as like trash of the society, junkie. So a lot of negative words addressed to people who use drugs. But for us, it was not an issue because we focus on the fair trial, focus on the human rights issues, and then we kind of develop our work and expertise around drug laws, drug policies, and then we started doing more work to advocate for a drug policy reform based on human rights, science, and compassion.
How are human rights being violated in the enforcement of drug laws here? What's that issue for you? Well, yeah. Why is this something that you need to be involved with?
Yeah. First, using drug is a privacy matters. Same like maybe smoking cigarettes or tobacco, which is also harmful for your health, but it's criminalized here. So you get imprisoned if you use drugs. That's first step of the human rights violation in the long procedures. During the police investigation, when the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture first visited Indonesia in 2008, he concluded that 80% of drug suspects experience torture. 80%, which is very high. And then during the hearing, very few suspects get adequate, competent legal defense to argue, to help the defense, to present evidence, to summon expert witnesses, and so on and so forth. And then stigma associated with drugs. Judges and prosecutors will say, oh, you're just using drugs, you're just junkie, go ahead to prisons. And then in prisons, if a person who uses drugs, they don't get the treatment there. And they're still using drugs. That's why still creating drug markets inside prison. And it breeds corruptions, of course, because you need a prison guard to help maintain or secure your trafficking inside the prison. And so those are all this series of human rights violations in the criminal justice system. Outside of the criminal justice systems, the narcotics laws requires people who use drugs to compulsorily report themselves to the authorities, which is a violation of a treatment, because treatment should be voluntary based instead of compulsory based. So those are just a glimpse of human rights abuses in drugs seen in Indonesia.
But what you're describing is a situation that is not unlike many places in the United States, for example. They can take a very hard line towards drugs. What makes Indonesia different in your experience so far?
Well, first, the use of the death penalty for drug offenses. Indonesia remains the most prolific countries in terms of sentencing people to death for drug offenses. And then in terms of executions, under Jokowi administration, in the first period of administration, within 18 months, he executed 18 people, all for drug offenses. Majority are foreigners. This has never happened before. After reformasi or after independence, that any Indonesian president carry out executions with such high numbers of executions. And then the killings, extrajudicial killings. Not long after Duterte was elected as president in the Philippines in 2016, Indonesia somehow copycat that kind of practices in 2017. So in 2016, we documented that there were 16 people, drug suspects, who were killed by the police or BNN, the National Narcotics Board. In 2017, it increased to 99. From 16 to 99. This was just after some police general appreciated and said what Duterte did in Philippines is a good thing, then we need to duplicate.
And these weren't suspects running away or in self-defense? So they actually went in and killed them?
So that's the issue, because the source only from the police. They said, oh, this suspect trying to run away or resist the arrest. But there were never any investigations after that or proof to say that they actually ran away.
So I suppose it's different in Indonesia, is at least they're going through the pretense of explaining it away or giving it excuses, whereas in the Philippines, the president just says, no, go out and shoot them. That's you totally have carte blanche for that. Whereas here, there's still some patina of shame.
Yes. In 2016-17, President Jokowi, during the Anti-Drugs Day ceremony, said, if drug suspect resist the police, don't hesitate to shoot them. So that's kind of like a green light for the police to take like serious actions against these drug suspects.
I just want to round off this point here about the attitudes toward drugs. And my feeling is that it's sort of a national security issue where an outside force, this intoxicant, is a threat to society. And it requires strongest vigilance on the part of security services, not really health, security services, an armed response. And this is because of the sense of threat. And if you do drugs, then you are part of some enemy force. Is that a fair description of it?
Yeah, so two things. Drugs has been seen as evil, and this has been since the 60s, when during Sukarno-Suharto regime, drugs, in addition to like gambling, are considered as like social deviants. And then grew out from there. When we had the narcotics law, drugs are criminalized. And then they started importing the type of drug war from the US, Nixon and Reagan. And then all this campaign of drugs are bad, drugs are evil, is deeply entrenched within the society. So that's why
wildly popular, right?
Yes.
I mean, if I go out there and I talk to a regular Indonesian, what do you think about capital punishment?
They will support.
They are all for it.
And then when you add with drugs, they go for it. And then the second one is the existential threat that you mentioned, that this whole narrative that drugs destroying society, it is even worse when the perpetrators are foreigners. Like you say, oh, foreigners trying to destroy Indonesia. This is from Australia, the US, or blah, blah, blah.
In fact, it's in the law, isn't it?
Yeah.
That it states that there needs to be a harder line taken against foreigners who import drugs. Is that right?
Well, not necessarily explicit, but that's the tendency in practice in the courts. When the judges see, oh, foreigners, they have this tendency of you're trying to destroy Indonesia by getting drugs inside to the country.
You're chairing a panel discussion by some visiting dignitaries from the Global Commission on Drug Policy. Now, this is a body with some pretty high-level people on it. Kofi Annan, who unfortunately died in 2018. But he was part of it. George Shultz, the former president of Brazil, Fernando Cardoso. They're also commissioners on this body that is keen on amending drug laws around the world, not just in Indonesia, to switch the emphasis onto health and harm mitigation. Decriminalizing, well, maybe you should explain. What does decriminalizing mean?
Well, at the moment, the narcotics law criminalize all kind of activities with regard to drugs. Drug use, selling, buying, possessions, export, import, and blah, blah, blah. So decriminalizing means removing all penalties from certain activities. For example, we advocate for decriminalizing of drug use and possession for personal consumption, which means if you're using drugs, there is no penalty for that. If you possess certain amount of drugs for your own personal use, that won't be criminalized.
No criminal penalty.
No criminal at
right.
all.
You're not going to go to jail or probation.
No.
You might pay a fine.
Criminalizations, which mean prohibiting drugs, puts drugs in the hands of the criminals. So they get the benefit if it's criminalized. By decriminalizing, we remove the benefit to the syndicates. And then by decriminalizing personal use, you would encourage people who use drugs to go to seek treatment. Because if you criminalize them, you don't want to report yourself that you need help because you get police arrest and so on and so forth. So that's why we put decriminalizations as an advocacy goal, which is different with legalizations. Legalizations means the drugs are regulated, so you can access maybe freely for recreational or for whatever reasons.
Like we're seeing with marijuana
Yes.
in a lot of places now.
Yeah. So for example, in Uruguay, they legalize cannabis. So you can cultivate cannabis at your home or with social clubs, or you can buy cannabis from pharmacies. Mm-hmm. But decriminalizing means still all those kind of activities are prohibited, are criminalized. It's only maybe personal use which is decriminalized.
Right. Now, you had some luminaries here visiting last week. Yeah. I think you had Jeff Gallop, who's a former premier of Western Australia. You had the president of
former president of Switzerland.
Former Ruth Dreyfus. And you had Jose Ramos Horta from East Timor.
Yeah.
How did their message of decriminalization and harm mitigation
so they went to see Minister of Health, Governor Jakarta's office, Minister of Law and Human Rights, Minister for Internal Affairs, and the National Human Rights Commission and National Commission on Violence Against Women. Right. And all of these meetings, they raised the idea of Indonesia needs to consider decriminalizing drug use, to reduce the burden of overcrowding prisons, to shift the orientation from criminal punitive approaches to health approaches. I mean, I got the impression that some officials are reluctant to discuss this, which is understandable because they will say drugs are...
How so? How are they reluctant?
Well, they always say drugs are evil, drugs are bad. We are in the state of drug emergency situation. 40, 50 people die every day because of drugs. It's not necessarily credible, these numbers. So that's the importance. Let's do proper research. Let research inform our public policy debate. Don't let prejudice guides our discussions, because it is only led by fears instead of reasons and science and human rights. So that's why the purpose of Global Commission on Drug Policy to come to Jakarta is to raise the awareness of having these frank conversations around drugs and drug policy.
I'm imagining their mindset, like a lot of Indonesian senior officials. You'll get a meeting, it'll be polite, but in the back of their minds somewhere, if they're not thinking about something else, is you're a foreigner, you don't really understand. You're talking about foreign stuff that might work in your country, but it doesn't here. How do you square that circle? It's almost as if you're not even speaking the same language. Like with respect to human rights, their view is drugs are evil. It is a foreign threat. It is a threat to the community. It deserves, as I said before, a response from security services. It's not a question of human rights. People are dying, as they say. How do you square that circle? Where do you even start to get people on the same page?
First, drug use, drug addiction, first and foremost is a health issue. I think that needs to be heard by government officials. It's same like addiction maybe to tobacco or cigarette. And when we have discussions around drugs, have we properly and openly discussed about the harmful effects of drugs to our health? Let's say cannabis, whether it's really dangerous if compared to tobacco or cigarettes. WHO says that cannabis has medical benefits. So let's start with that. I mean, this is like World Health Organization, the authority to say cannabis has a medical purposes. But here we prohibit it. So why don't we explore these options of cannabis for medical purposes? Secondly, criminalizations and prohibition approach towards drugs contributed to global phenomenon, and that is the increase of prison overcrowding. And this happens everywhere, not just in Indonesia.
I think you told me that half of criminal convictions are for drug.
Yes, in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Yes, more than in some prisons, it's more than 50%. It almost reaches 70-80%. This happens in Thailand. This happens in the Philippines. This happens in the U.S. This happens in many countries. In Thailand, they started implementing cannabis for medical purposes. In Malaysia, also same experience the prison overcrowding problems, but they are now discussing about the decriminalizing drug use. But why not Indonesia? It's not like isolated Indonesian problems or sometimes they say Asian values, which is not really Asian values. It's a global problem. So let's discuss it and have a frank discussion, which is, I think that's what they are afraid of. If presented with facts that eye-opening rather than like just keep talking and business as usual.
Tedjo, you spent 5 years in prison, I think?
Hanya 1 tahun 4 bulan.
1 tahun 4 bulan, 1 year 4 months.
Yang terakhir ya.
The last one.
So you've done at least 2 bouts in prison?
2 kali di penjara.
3 kali.
3 times.
3 times. Was this for usage or were you selling?
Iya.
Yes, or for all use.
You're sober now? When did you start your rehabilitation?
Awalnya waktu 2014 setelah keluar dari penjara yang terakhir, saya nggak diterima oleh keluarga karena keluarga mungkin sudah terlalu malu menerima kehadiran saya dari penjara. Waktu itu ingat slogan di rumah Singapura kan, ketika dunia menolakmu datanglah ke rumah Singapura.
Okay, so in 2014 when he got out from prison, he wanted to go back to the family, but his family rejected him because family was so ashamed of him, probably because he's been on and off prisons. And then he remembered a slogan from Peka halfway house in Bogor: if the world rejects you, this is a home for you. So that's why he went to Peka.
And that mantra is that you have a home here, you belong, we're with you. That was encouragement to continue on a path. Is that right?
Iya, karena memang untuk di Solo sendiri, kota kelahiran saya, dan waktu itu kan juga berpikir udah mulai capek, dikejar-kejar sama polisi, BNN terus, ya udahlah. Dan ada motivasi dari yang membuat salah satu dari teman, udahlah, kalau lo masih mau bantu orang ya minimal lo harus bisa bantu diri lo sendiri dulu.
Yeah, so in Solo, his hometown, there were no proper community-based treatments, and he felt tired because of police arrest. And then one time his friend said, if you want to start helping others, you have to help yourself. And that's where he began his journey.
And that journey took you into the law. Why the law, and what services do you provide?
Lebih banyak melihat waktu di dalam penjara teman-teman yang tidak mendapatkan keadilan, susah mencari layanan bantuan hukum yang berkualitas, dan akhirnya mereka menjadi bulan-bulanan oknum penegak hukum yang memeras untuk mendapatkan hasil yang minimal.
I saw firsthand many of my friends who are in prison, they never got justice. They got higher sentence despite of the small amount of drugs, and they were extorted by the police or by the law apparatus, and outraged because of that situations, he wanted to do something, and that's where he began his ideas of providing legal services for people who use drugs.
Well, I suppose it needs to be said here that lawyers can have a different role here. It's fair to say, especially when it comes to unsavory moral cases, whether it's pornography or whether it's gambling or if it's drugs. They're more of a negotiator, right? They're not necessarily defending your right. I'm not saying that this is you, Ricky.
Yeah.
I don't think you guys do this, but they negotiate the bribes, right? You're not necessarily going to stay in prison if you can come up with a whole bunch of money. They're really a facilitator, but he's offering actual representation, representing their interests. Is that right?
Jadi di awal pengaduan itu kita udah jelaskan di keluarganya si pecandu yang ketangkep ini. Jadi kalau akan kita dampingin, pintu untuk melakukan transaksional udah ditutup.
Yeah. So whenever family members complain to them, he always said to them that we will not negotiate, we will not do any transactions with the police, we don't do bribes, we don't do extortions. So that's like the first line that we need to draw with the family members.
Dan akhirnya juga banyak yang nggak kembali karena kita nggak pernah memberikan garansi kan. Tapi apa yang akan kita lakukan dengan upaya maksimal di jalur hukum yang benar. Jadi menyelesaikan masalah hukum tidak dengan melanggar hukum.
Yeah. So of course many of the family members they never got back to him because he never
no negotiation.
No, yeah. So he never promised anything. So he can't guarantee anything. But then eventually they realized that when he's successful, they understand that to address legal problems, you can do it without violating the laws.
Okay, then I have to ask, what is the probability of success if you negotiate a bribe versus following the law? Are you just signing up to be punished if you follow the law?
Sama-sama tidak ada jaminannya sih ya sebenarnya. Karena banyak juga keluarga korban pecandu yang datang ke kami sudah dalam kondisi habis-habisan karena
Sudah nih Pak.
udah jual rumah. Yang terakhir itu sampai habis hampir 1 miliar.
Yeah.
Masih 12 tahun juga. Di pledoi baru kita yang mengerjakan pledoi sampai sekarang diproses kasasi menjadi 6 tahun.
Okay.
Itu tanpa ada transaksional.
Yeah.
Terus ada juga ibu-ibu yang datang ke kami rumahnya udah dijual dan dia sekarang kontrak, anaknya masih di penjara 4 tahun.
So no guarantee actually because first you don't have the receipt when you bribes. So you can have that for
when you negotiate a bribe.
You don't get
that
the
might be
receipt.
sunk money. That money might just be gone.
Yes,
right.
exactly. So that's why he referred to 3 cases. First, most of the family members, when they complained to his organizations, some of them already bankrupt. They paid hundreds of millions or billions to the police, but the family members, the sons, ended up in prison still. One family, their sons got 12 years. They bribed, they paid the police, the judges, prosecutors, but got 12 years imprisonment, and then they helped with the appeal and then got reduced to 6 years. So it shows that it doesn't guarantee even if you bribe.
I suppose I need to backtrack a little. It might come as a surprise that haggling over a bribe is part of the criminal justice system here, isn't it? Can you give me a sense, maybe between both of you, to paint for a foreign audience, where does bribery fit in to this whole equation and how prevalent is it?
Hampir semuanya sih ya. Jadi selalu ditawarkan dari pihak oknum ya, kita sebut oknum penegak hukum selalu menawarkan, bahkan saya dulu juga digituin. Kalau kamu mau rehab ya 40 juta. Waktu itu saya berjawab sih, daripada saya bayar dulu Pak, mending mati di penjara aja busuk. Nah, hal ini sebenarnya sering yang terjadi transaksional karena sebenarnya dari komunitas juga, karena mereka membiasakan hal itu dan akhirnya jadilah mereka ditangkap, diperes. Saya punya mimpi ketika teman-teman semuanya tidak melakukan transaksional, saya yakin polisi tidak bakal nangkap lagi.
Yeah,
karena ada duitnya.
Yeah, it's highly prevalent in terms of bribes and corruptions in drugs cases, especially. It's like either they directly and explicitly offer release for certain amount of rupiahs, or they just condition the situation that as if you pay the bribes and then you get lenient sentence. So they don't really ask the bribes explicitly. But also on the other hand, maybe because of the society is used to like paying bribes to make things easier, so it gets like this mutualistic symbiosis between police, law enforcement, and the community and the society, because it's either you automatically pay or they ask you to pay and then you pay eventually. And so that is so pervasive in the society that it's like our mindset. If you pay, it gets easier.
And if you don't pay, is there any evidence that you get a longer sentence?
Ada juga. Jadi contoh kasus yang waktu saya di Jogja itu dari 80 orang yang ada di rutan, itu 57% itu adalah mahasiswa. Semuanya melakukan transaksional. Karena apa? Ternyata setelah kita gali lebih dalam, mereka diintimidasi sama penyidik. Kalau kamu tidak membayar, hukumanmu akan lebih dari 6 bulan. Artinya kalau 6 bulan kuliah kamu akan DO, karena rata-rata yang ditangkap tuh tidak ada satupun yang asli Jogja. Semuanya perantau semuanya. Jadi ada 2 orang yang memang nggak punya uang, dia akhirnya mendapatkan 6 tahun dan 5 tahun, yang sisanya itu semuanya bayar, hukumannya antara 3 sampai 6 bulan.
When he was in prison in Jogja, there were like 80 students that he identified, and mostly all of them are charged for drugs offenses, and then half of them are extorted by the police, and then if they pay, they get lenient sentence. That's the promise from the police, and the police always intimidated them, and because these are law students, they said if you got arrested for drugs, you spend 6 months in prisons. That's like a dropout from the law schools, and of course they will pay. So that's why it's so deeply ingrained.
Well, their future's on the line, isn't it?
Exactly.
You can't have a criminal record if you're trying to become a lawyer, right? Yeah, so they're going to pay.
Yes, because of that intimidation, which is also common not just for law students, but all for ordinary people. They get these intimidations. And of course, police is the first contact. These ordinary people, they don't know that they have the rights to contact lawyers. Even if they say, I want to contact LBH or I want to contact my lawyers, they will say, oh, that just makes things complicated. Forget about it. If you pay me, it gets easier. So things like that.
Yeah. Tedjo, you said back in 2014, your family disowned you, that you were in and out of prison. What's the standing now with your family? Do you reaccepted?
Ya, setelah 2015 di tahun pertama saya nggak make itu, keluarga sudah mulai menghubungi, sudah mulai menanyakan kapan kamu pulang, kayak gitu, dan sampai sekarang pun hubungannya semakin inilah sebenarnya hadiah pemulihan yang terbesar bagi saya adalah ketika sudah diakui lagi oleh keluarga, udah dimasukin lagi ke grup-grup WA keluarga besar, dan selalu ditanyakan kapan kamu pulang.
Yeah, so a year after he started his journey to stop using drugs, his family already reaching out, asking when he would come home to Solo. And then in the past couple of years, he's been accepted to the WhatsApp groups of families. And then that's like he considered as a gift, of the biggest gift of his recovery, of his journey, to be able to meet and spend time with family.
That is wonderful news. I'm really happy to hear that. I'm going to get all choked up. And that's On the Level. Our producer is Stephen Handoko. Research by Imam Shofwan. Art by Ismail Fa. Music is courtesy of Poddington Bear. And if you like us, share the pod with your friends. And follow us on Instagram at onthelevel_podcast. I'm Jeff Hutton. Thanks for listening.